Good morning, everyone, and also good night for Alberto. It's night at the state at the moment, yeah. And then thank you for joining with this webinar for the Data and Computational Journalism Conference Indonesia, or the DCJ 2022. And then today it's a very special morning because we're gonna have a speaker, an expert in data visualizations and journalism and data journalism principles, Alberto Cairo from University of Miami, gonna give us a presentations about the ethics of data journalism and data visualizations in the next minutes. Before that, I'm gonna just introduce myself a bit. So I'm currently teaching data-driven journalism at the Universitas Multimedia Nusantara, and got a degree, my master degree from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and a professional certificate on computational journalism at Columbia University. And I'm gonna read the bio for Alberto Cairo. So our speaker today is the Knight Chair in Visual Journalism at the School of Communications of the University of Miami. He's also the director of the Visualizations program at University of Miami's Institute for Data Science and Computing. And Alberto is the author also of several books about visualization, such as The Truthful Art and How Charts Lie. And he has led visualization teams in media organizations in Spain, Brazil, and the United States. And it's a regular consultant for several governmental organizations and companies such as Google. So Alberto's background is very varied between academics and also practitioners. So it's we can learn a lot about data visualizations based on the perspective of practitioners and also an academics. And I would like also to explain a bit about the whole sessions. So in the beginning, we will hear the presentations from Alberto, and after that, we will open the Q&A sessions in which the participants are allowed to write and type the questions in the chat, and then I'm gonna read the questions both from the Zoom sessions and also from YouTube. And if you like to listen also for the interpretations, you can click the interpretations button on the Zoom, and then you will listen into the Indonesian versions of the presentations. Okay, without further ado, I'm gonna just give the floor to you, Alberto.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's evening over here in Miami, but I was telling the organizers that after 6 or 7 p.m., my body starts slowing down, but I'm going to try to speed up again. So yeah, well, thank you for having me. My goal today is to share with you some ideas about how I think about data visualization, particularly in the context of journalism. I usually introduce myself as a journalist first. So even if I collaborate with organizations that do data science and analytics and statistics, I consider myself above all a communicator. Anyway, so as the organizers were saying, I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can see it. Desktop, here it is. So yeah, so I'm a journalist by training. I was educated in Spain. I also worked in Brazil, and my entire career has been devoted to the design of either explanation graphics using illustrations to tell stories or to explain complex issues. I still draw a little bit. You can see that there is a drawing board there behind me because I draw. But most of my career has been devoted to the design and also to the teaching of data visualization, which is the visual representation of numbers, and that is what I'm going to be focusing on today. So the books that were mentioned essentially by the organizers before are essentially a way for me to express the ideas that cross my mind, or that in my mind about how to better make data visualizations. So The Truthful Art, How Charts Lie. And right now at the moment, I'm working on a new book that I'm titling The Art of Insight, which consists of a series of conversations with visualization designers from all over the world, not necessarily just journalists, but visualization designers that come from many different professions. And the reason why I'm writing this new book, which is so different to the previous ones, is that in the past few years, I have sort of like evolved in the way that I see data visualization. And I'm trying to see whether these ideas that are in my mind right now are actually common out there. So I'm going to share some of these ideas with you, some of the teachings that I try to incorporate to my classes and also to the work that I do. The first one is that not everything needs to be a visualization. For many, many years, there has been this drive to transform everything, not only in journalism, but also in many other fields, into some sort of graphic, all right, into some sort of visual explanation, into some sort of data visualization. More specifically, data visualization is a ways to reveal patterns and trends in data, right? The foundational books about data visualization explain this really well. For example, Exploratory Data Analysis, which is a book written by the statistician John Tukey, said that, this was written in the 60s and published in the 70s, said that visualization is really important when we want to see the shape of the data, when we want to understand what patterns and trends may hide behind a bunch of numbers, for example, right? Because Tukey used to say that the greatest value of a picture is that it helps us see things that may otherwise go unnoticed. So data begins being just a bunch of numbers, right? Like the numbers that we have on the screen right now, right? Tons of numbers, tons of columns, tons of rows, tons of observations. This is a data set about the average global temperatures all over the world between the year 1000 up to the year 2000. So 1000 years of global temperatures. Now, when it is appropriate to use a visualization? Well, a visualization is useful when the goal of the presentation that we are designing is that people are able to see patterns or trends in the data. If, on the other hand, what we want to do or what we want people to see is the actual values, right? There's nothing beats a table, right? So in cases when the situation or the goal of the graphic that we are designing is to expose readers to the numbers themselves, we should design a table. We should not design a data visualization. A data visualization is useful when we want to reveal the big stories that may lie behind these numbers, or when we want to ask questions that are more related not to the specific values of the data set, but to all the overall trends or patterns in the data. For example, if we wanted to answer the question, have global temperatures increased or decreased in the past 1000 years, right? If we want to answer that question using just the tabular presentation of numbers, it will take us quite a long time because we will need to read all these numbers and see whether these numbers are increasing or decreasing. Whereas if we transform these numbers into graphics of different kinds, these are just two representations of a similar data set, average global temperatures all over the world, we can notice whether these numbers are increasing or decreasing by the visual representation of those numbers. The graphic on the left, a time series line chart, the traditional line chart that shows global temperatures increasing very sharply in the past 100 years. And then the graphic on the right-hand side is commonly known as the warming stripes, represent the numbers using shades of color. So the redder the color and the more intense the red of that color, the higher the number that that color is representing. So sometimes we need to design visualizations. Sometimes it's better to just show people the actual numbers. And the decision needs to be made based on whether we think that the patterns are more important than the numbers or the numbers are more important than the patterns. On the first case, we need a visualization. On the second case, we will need a table. Another very important, I think, lesson that I have learned throughout the years, and that is, it is something that I encourage people whom I teach to think about quite a lot, right? Particularly journalists, is to think about what level of detail in the visualization better tells the story, better reveals the numbers or the realities behind those numbers. Because we journalists, in particular, tend to usually oversimplify the presentations that we create, the graphics that we create. Let me show you an example. This comes from one of my latest books. So this is the murder rate in the United States from 1960 to 2015. The murder rate increased during the 70s and the 80s. It decreased during the 90s. It stayed the same more or less on the 2000s. You see that the line is flat between 2000 and 2010 or something like that. And then in the past few years, since 2015, 2016, the murder rate in the United States is increasing again. If we extend the line closer to the present, that line continues increasing. Well, there is nothing wrong with this graphic. The graphic is based on the best data available out there, but it is very easy to misinterpret. And it's very easy to misinterpret because it's an oversimplification of a very complex reality that may need to be represented somehow, or represented at a much deeper level of detail. So the graphic, when we read it, it can be misinterpreted by saying that the United States in the past 6 or 7 years is becoming a more dangerous country. Well, is that true or not? Well, on average, yes. On average, it is becoming a more dangerous country. But averages are very, very dangerous, because it is not true that the United States is becoming a more dangerous country in general. If instead of representing the national murder rate, number of murders per 100,000 people, we represented this same number at a local level, most places in the United States, if we could represent them with little dots, each one of those dots representing a town or a city in the United States, those dots will be around the national rate or below the national rate. The United States in general is a pretty safe country. There are not many murders in the United States. So why is the curve increasing? Well, it is increasing because of the effect of outliers, of extreme values. There are certain places in the United States that in the past 6 or 7 years have become so dangerous, and the number of murders has increased so much that they skewed the national rate. They increased the national rate. But that doesn't mean that murders are increasing everywhere on average. On average, yes, right? But when we take a look at a more detailed view, a more granular view of the data, we may identify these patterns. Whenever I talk about examples such as this one to an audience of journalists, I usually say that if we want to do a story about crime in the United States, showing this graphic is not a lie. The graphic is not lying, but the interpretation of the graphic may lie. The journalist has the responsibility to think about what level of detail better tells the story. Therefore, we should aim for something like this. We can still create a graphic that shows the national rate, but at the same time, we need to explain to our readers what is going on with this data. We will need to represent the data at a much more detailed level. Another question is how to make choices about the best ways to represent our information, meaning should we use a bar graph or a line graph or a pie chart, and the answer to that question takes quite a long time to develop, to learn. It takes a long time to learn methods to make choices about graphic forms. But what I usually encourage people is that most of the time, I think that we should stick to traditional graphic forms, right? The bar graph, the line graph, different types of data maps. And there are many websites out there that can help us make good choices in data visualization. There is, for example, the Data Visualization Catalog is a very good website that can help anybody who is interested in learning more about data visualization make good choices about the better type of graphic for every situation. Or the Visual Vocabulary, which is a poster that was designed originally by the Financial Times, the graphics department of the Financial Times, that it is also a guide of what type of graphic may adapt better to every type of purpose, depending on what we want to show. If we want people to compare things, to see change over time, or to see the association or relationship between different variables, each one of those goals may need a completely different type of graphic, right? And this is what I mean by traditional types of graphics, traditional graphic forms. But sometimes it might be appropriate, depending on the circumstances, to explore, to go a little bit beyond what is acceptable, to try to be a little bit more creative. This will be the minority of times, right? As I said before, a majority of time, 90% of the time, I will recommend you all to stick to traditional graphic forms because this is what readers are more used to seeing. But in types of projects that are a little bit more, let's say the topic that we are covering is a little bit more fun, a little bit more humorous. It's also appropriate to have fun with the data. For example, years ago, I art directed a project by a Nadie Bremer, who is a visualization designer from the Netherlands. She designed a project titled "Why Do Cats and Dogs?" Right? So it's a project that we made in collaboration with Google. Google provided all the data, search data, related to what people all over the world search for in Google, what we search for if you have a pet, when we search for why is my dog doing or why is my cat doing what are the most common types of searches. And then Nadie created this beautiful website in which she used beautiful illustrations and animations, and then you can scroll down and you can choose whether you are a dog person or a cat person. I have dogs. So what are the most common types of searches, right, in Google? Well, why is my dog licking? That is the most common type of search. When we search for why is my dog doing whatever, this is the most common type of search. But then we can dig a little bit deeper into the data, right? We can say, why is my dog licking people so much? Feet, me, you. These are all searches in Google. And the size of the bubble is proportional to the search interest for that, right? So it's sort of like a proxy for the amount of searches. Why is my dog eating different types of things? Grass, poop. Why is my dog biting, chewing, etc., 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 right? So as you can see, this is not a traditional type of visualization. It's something a little bit more creative. And she decided to use this style precisely because the topic itself was humorous. And therefore, the presentation of the project also needed to match sort of like the spirit of that project, be humorous as well. Another important thing to remember is that graphics usually don't explain themselves. Sometimes they need to be paired, actually quite often, they need to be paired with words. So down here in Florida, we are used to seeing this type of graphic quite often. This is called the hurricane cone, right? Whenever we have a hurricane approaching Florida or the United States, the National Hurricane Center, which is a governmental agency, publishes a map that shows where the hurricane may go, right? It looks like a cone, right? Well, most people who see this type of graphic the first time, they misinterpret it completely. They think that the cone represents an area under threat. So if you are inside of the cone, you are in danger, or if you're outside of the cone, you are not in danger, right? They sort of like read this graphic, that cone represented on the map, as representing sort of like the size of the hurricane, right? Increasing and threatening that area that is enclosed in the cone. When in reality, what the cone is representing is uncertainty, right? Scientists who predict where hurricanes may go don't know exactly where a hurricane may go. What they do is to create visualizations that, using that cone, represent possible positions of the storm in the following 5 days. The infographic on the right-hand side, I created it years ago to explain how to read this type of graphic, right? That essentially the size of the cone is not a representation of the areas that can be potentially under threat. It's actually an area in which the center of the storm may be in the following 5 days, all right? All the area inside the cone is sort of like a set of possible positions of the hurricane center in the following 5 days. That will be the way to interpret that map correctly.
To interrupt, so we have 5 more minutes.
Yeah. I'm about to finish. So that is a reason why it's useful to use words in visualizations, never to assume that the visualization alone is enough to tell the story, right? As journalists, we need to find a way to pair words and visuals. And we cannot go wrong by taking a look at the work of the best out there. For example, Professor Hans Rosling, who passed a few years ago, Professor Hans Rosling was a professor of international health in Sweden, who became a master in presenting data visualizations, highly complex data visualizations, pairing those data visualizations with words, right? With the way that he presented information. I'm not going to show you an entire presentation of his. I'm going to just encourage you to take a look at his work if you have the chance. The last few slides, by the way, that I'm going to share with you today contain tons of resources that you can follow if you want to learn more about data visualization in the future. So he used his body language, his words, etc., to put the information in context. And this is something that we can all do as journalists, not just showing the data, but show the data as Rosalind used to do, but also pair that with written stories or with spoken stories if we represent all this graphic on a TV screen, for example. Anyway, that's all that I have for now. So we are going to open the Q&A now. While we would go to the Q&A, what I'm going to do is to export my slides as a PDF, and I'm going to share it with share that PDF with the organizers, and then the organizers can send that link to everybody. Because the slide deck contains, I'm not going to show that, but the next slides after this one is a bunch of links about data visualization, articles, free books, free tools, and so on and so forth. For those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more, I just put there a ton of free resources for you to use in the future.
Okay. Thank you so much for the presentations, Alberto, and then so very generous of you to share the resources about data visualizations to the participants here. So it's very interesting the things that you mentioned on the graph, especially related to the stick to the traditional form of graphs. Because when we, in the past, when we saw all the visualizations created during the pandemic, like a lot of forms appeared actually outside than the traditional form of graphs. Maybe later in the Q&A sessions, while we are waiting for the participants to ask questions, I have questions about that actually. So because in my class also my students tend to use sophisticated graphic. I already told them, and then using also your principle, don't think about the data first, and then what is the functions that you want to use, and then choose the graphics that best representing it. But then because youngsters likes to have some aesthetic things to show to the readers, and then they will always use other kinds of graphics. But in the visualizations tools, especially in the open source visualizations tools, like Floris or maybe Data Wrapper, we also see other forms of graphics. And so in which are there any times when we can use other types of graphics rather than the traditional one?
Absolutely. Whenever we make choices in how to represent our information, we need to balance out different considerations. We need to balance out how effective that graphic is at communicating something, how attractive it is going to be for the reader who is going to take a look at it as a sheer visual object, like a piece of art or something like that, how fun it will be to look at, and also how familiar we think that our audience is with the type of graphic that we are presenting to them. And all those considerations need to balance out. Because, for example, the most common type of visualization is the bar graph, the bar chart. Everybody knows how to read a bar chart, right? The length of the bar is proportional to the data, or the height of the bar is proportional to the data. So if all that we care about is the effectiveness of the graphic, probably a bar chart or a line chart or a pie chart, those are the most common types of graphics. People are very familiar with those type of graphics. So if all we care about is being effective, direct, and be clear as possible, and just communicate as clear as possible, then we should stick to those types of graphic forms. We could go beyond them, or we could also use maps. There are other types of graphics that are also quite common. So being familiar to our audience is a really important consideration. However, that doesn't mean that in certain circumstances, as I tried to explain with the why do cats and dogs type of graphic, we cannot experiment with other types of graphics. The vocabulary of visualization is expanding on a regular basis. And if we just stick to bar graphs, line charts, pie charts, and maps, we will never experiment with other types of graphics. And therefore, our audiences will never get used to seeing those types of graphics. There was a time in journalism, for example, when it was impossible to see scatter plots. A scatter plot is a type of graphic like Rosling graphic that I showed at the end. You have two axes, you have little dots, and it's a type of graphic that is intended to show you the correlation, the association between two variables, right? That type of graphic today is quite common in the United States and in Europe, in news media. I don't know whether it is common in Indonesia, but it's certainly more common in the United States and in England than it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, when I began my career, no newspaper published scatter plots. Why? Well, because editors at newspapers say, oh, the readers will never understand this graphic, right? But that is a self-defeating a strategy, because obviously, if you never publish a scatter plot, people will never learn how to read a scatter plot. Therefore, what could be done is what Hans Rosling did in his presentations, which is to show the scatter plot, but then also explain how to read the scatter plot, because a scatter plot is sometimes the best way to represent our data. It is only that our readers may not be that familiar with that type of graphic. And also, one last consideration is the attractiveness of the graphic. Sometimes we create visualizations not necessarily just to present the data as accurately as possible. Sometimes we need sort of like a large and beautiful image to attract people's attention. That is not the only thing that we should design, but it could be the opening of a page, right? For example, the warming stripes graphic that I showed before about climate change. That graphic, which uses shades of color to represent global warming, is not particularly precise or accurate, right? But it is very beautiful. It's very beautiful to look at, and it captures people's imagination. You can use that. We can use that as an opening for a story, and when people scroll down, then they can see the more traditional types of graphics. So that's the way that I make choices myself when selecting types of graphics. I try to balance out all those considerations.
Okay. Got it. So we have a questions here related actually with choosing graphs and also presenting the data, but the question is from the audience is more related to the steps of interpreting and also analyzing the data before creating the graphics and also like to present stories, not only focusing on the graphic, but also highlighting the data. So what are your steps in doing that? Like things to do first before achieving the graphic part?
You cannot design a good data visualization if you don't have a good understanding of what the data is, what the limitations are, how variables were defined, how things were measured. So if you don't have a good analytical understanding of the data that you're handling. Now, most journalists, we are not trained in data analysis. I was not trained in data analysis. I mean, I can do a little bit of data analysis because I taught myself, but whenever I need to do the analytical part of the process, I don't do it myself. I just rely on people who are data scientists or data analysts or statisticians. I mean, I partner up with people who know much more than I do about the data. And this is something that is becoming more and more common in the world of journalism, at least in the United States, but not only. Some media organizations, for example, ProPublica, which is a nonprofit, a investigative reporting organization in the United States, which in my opinion is the gold standard in data journalism these days, they regularly partner up with statisticians from Harvard University, epidemiologists from Johns Hopkins University. Why? Well, because they don't have internally sufficient expertise to analyze different types of data, right? You will need experts in those areas. So those experts really exist. So why don't we partner up with them? And then we provide sort of like the journalistic side of things. We help those statisticians, those scientists find the stories in the data, and then in partnership with them, we create the story. That is my approach nowadays, because it is impossible to become a good designer, a good journalist, a good analyst, a good designer. I mean, I can count with the fingers in my hand, perhaps on one hand, the people who can complete the entire process. So that's the first step, having a good understanding of the data. And then everything derives from that, everything else, choosing graphic forms, the structure of the story. It all depends on the understanding of the numbers. That is what underlies everything everything else. I make graphic choices and graphic forms, choices on a story structure. Then I tend to sort of like iterate my process, showing the stories that I'm designing to people to read them and see how they react, whether they're understanding or not. And sometimes I need to go back to the drawing board. So it's a very iterative process.
Right. So you're highlighting about the collaborations between
Yeah.
news media with the university. I also saw the ProPublica's project about the hurricane in Texas, in which they collaborated a lot with the university.
They do it constantly, and they do it more and more precisely because they know that we cannot be experts at everything.
Right,
and if we try
right.
to do the analysis ourselves, we will get it wrong, precisely because we don't have it's very easy to think that you are analyzing the data correctly simply because you know about statistics and because you know how to use the tools of statistics. That's hubris. You cannot analyze data if you don't have a qualitative understanding of the data.
Right. Yeah. We also talked and highlighted that collaborations actually in our sessions yesterday, highlighting the needs of more collaborations between university and media, which has not been found many in the practice of media in Indonesia. So definitely that would be a good insight to us too and to the participants. And we will continue. I will continue with the next questions from the audience about the type of graphic before how to choose, like why not to stick, why need to stick to the traditional one. But now like there are types of static and also interactive graphics. When to choose the data by using the static one, and when to choose to present the data with the interactive one, and which one is better? Is there any better?
There's no better.
No
I
better.
mean, nothing in visualization is better in the abstract. Things are better or worse depending on what your goals are and what you want to communicate. For me, interaction is like any other feature in a graphic. So if interaction serves a purpose, then I use it. If it doesn't serve a purpose, then I don't use it. I just do a static graphic. So when is interaction useful? So when, for example, we want people to be able to find themselves in the data, when we want people to drill down so they can see themselves or their own neighborhood or search for something, compare something to something else, and somehow look for themselves in the data. That is when interaction comes in. But if I can get away with no interaction, I don't use interaction. I just show the entire thing so people can see it. So in the same view, in a single layer. So like everything in visualization, like animation, for example, animation is very similar to interaction. Animation can be really powerful, but only when I think it's appropriate. If I can get away with no animation, I don't use animation. Same with interaction. So that's the way that I think about things myself.
Okay, so there is a questions from the YouTube one. Alberto, can you also share your experience in teaching data journalism and visualizations to your students? Probably interesting story.
Yeah, so I have many stories about this. So for example, when I was hired at the university a decade ago, most of the students who came to my classes came from a journalism background or from a interaction design background. So I had mostly designers and journalists in the room, and therefore I had to focus much more on the thinking about the data side of things. I didn't need to teach them that much about design because many of them already knew about visual design. I taught them about visualization design, which is sort of like they need to adapt their knowledge of design to the specifics of data visualization. But I didn't need to focus that much on sort of like elementary principles of design, right? Alignment, layout, typography, hierarchy. I didn't need to focus that much on that. I had to focus more on the analytical side. Now, things changed. So little by little, up to this point, today, I would say that 8 out of 10 or even 9 out of 10 of my students are not journalists. I have a small minority of journalists in my classes. What I tend to have is data scientists, statisticians, biologists, meteorologists, medical doctors coming to my class to learn about data visualization. Why? Because they want to learn how to communicate using data visualization with the general public. So I find myself at the very beginning, so to speak, teaching elementary statistics to journalists And today I find myself, onto designers, and today I find myself more not teaching statistics at all, because obviously, what am I going to teach about statistics to data scientists, right? I can't, right? They already know everything that they need to know. But I find myself teaching more the design side of things, the structuring of the story side of things. So because of the audience, because the audience is different, because the the students who come to class are completely different. So I focus much more on the design side, on design aspects, such as, for example, interaction that you ask about, the use of color, and then the graphic design principles.
Okay, and related to that, so what kind of data visualization tools that you use to your students, like to teach, like a lot of like options, right? Like from Florist, data wrapper, and also the 3DS for interactive, like which one that you?
I don't teach D3 in my class because my class is the introduction. We have three or four levels in our program. So we have the intro class, then there's an interaction visualization design class, there's a data visualization studio class. There are 3 or 4 different. We also have classes on mapping, so they can learn GIS and mapping in other classes. So my class is the introduction, so the principles, etc. So I tend to try to expose the students to tools that are easy to learn and easy to use. You mentioned some of them: data wrapper, Flourish. I try to expose them also to raw graphs. I teach them Adobe Illustrator because Illustrator is still a very powerful tool to design, particularly simple static graphics, and it's a tool that is used everywhere in news media. I try to expose them to a little bit of coding, so I expose them to a little bit of the R programming language, because that's the language that I know how to use. No, I'm not an expert, but I know how to code a little bit. So I expose them to R. So as many tools as possible. But then when they need to develop their projects, some of my students, as I said before, they come from statistics and data science. So they already know how to use some statistical programs. Some of them are actually quite advanced using R. So I said, just use that. Or they know how to use Tableau, which is another, particularly students who come from a background in business analytics, they know how to use Tableau, which is an interactive visualization tool. So I let them use those tools, right? I just say, use the tools that you already know, but then try to use also one of the tools that you learned in the classroom. And then more advanced classes, the interactive visualization class, it focuses on JavaScript and D3. The mapping classes, they use ArcGIS and other GIS programs. So every class uses a completely different toolkit, a completely different tool set.
For the basic, the introductions to data visualizations, do you already teach them like coding, or you start with?
No, I just expose them to coding. So I don't teach them. I don't teach. So my classes focus much more on the story structure, the choices about visualization, etc. Software, what I do is to give the students tutorials to complete on their own at home. I don't teach the software in the classroom. That would be a waste of time. I have a long tutorial about Adobe Illustrator, so I assign a tutorial that I recorded. I assign a short tutorial about R. I give them the educational materials for Flourish and data wrappers so they can experiment with the tool. So I try to expose them to several tools, and then let them choose, because they may like Flourish or data wrapper or R or whatever. I say, I don't care. I mean, I'm completely software agnostic. You can choose whatever tool you like the most. Just go with that. But at least know that these tools exist.
Okay, so we're going to move to another questions from the participants from Tri Suharman. So he asks about now data visualization has been a demand in every media to make, like every media will create a data visualizations. However, a lot of data visualizations products or graphics have become so complicated, and then the message aren't clear enough. Mm-hmm. And so he's asking about, okay, so how to choose the data so that it could be presented to readers in the most understandable and easy way so that the readers can absorb the message clearly. Like you mentioned before about like graphics, we cannot assume the interpretations of graphic like you. So, but how to do it?
So again, I mean that will take an entire year to cover, because that's what my classes are about, right? But there are certain things that we can think about, and so how do you write a story, right? How do you write a story as a journalist, right? You first investigate whatever it is that you need to investigate. You gather your information, and then you try to structure some sort of narrative that tells the story of your investigation from the beginning to the end in an understandable manner. So you create a structure for the information. It's identical in data visualization. So it's like the same process. It's like you need to gather the information, process it, filter, organize it, and then try to find, this is very important, trying to find the right balance between being understandable and being deep enough, which is what I mentioned before when talking about the murder rate graphic, right? Yeah, the first graphic is very simple, very easy to understand, or better say, very easy to misunderstand, because the graphic doesn't present enough, a sufficient amount of information. We journalists tend to worry too much about making things simpler, when we should worry more is about making things clear. And sometimes to make things clear, we cannot remove information. We need to keep the detail that we were about to remove. That will be one of those cases. We need to find the right balance between showing too much, or showing too little. We need to stay in between, right? And that's an art. It's very similar to, again, to when we write a story, right? So when we write a story, we also need to provide sufficient context for whatever it is that we are writing about. And then we need to make decisions about the structuring of the story, right? In the case of a narrative written story, what will be the thread? What will be the backbone of the story? What will be the chapters of the story? In the case of data visualization is, again, how to structure the information, or how to make better choices in terms of choosing graphic forms to represent the data. It is true that in the past years, maybe there have been some graphics that are overly complex for the audience that is going to consume them. But at the same time, there have been graphics that have been too simplistic for the audience that consumes it. And that also worries me. Not only overcomplication, but also oversimplification, because oversimplification can be extremely damaging as well.
I really like your presentations on the oversimplified things, because like we can see a lot of some of that graphics using that, like rates, and to show in general about the nationwide, right? Like it's
nationwide. To talk, when in reality what you need is data at the local level, right? The patterns that you see at a national level may be completely different than the patterns that you will see at the local level using the same data. So you need to find what is the right level of aggregation to use for every story. I mean, this is something that is very elementary in statistics, right? But it is not elementary in journalism, just because we don't have expertise in statistics.
Wow, this has been like a very interesting discussions, and then unfortunately we come to the end of the sessions, and then we only have like several minutes. There is one questions, the last questions, probably you can answer and also give to the participant the closing statements for these sessions, and by answering the questions related to this. So there is a question from Samiaji Bintang, and he asks about how to make story with data journalism that makes impact to the public. And Alberto, maybe you can answer and also give us the closing statement for
how to make an impact. Well, that could be a closing statement. Don't obsess about making an impact. That is not your goal. That is not my goal. My goal is to, honestly, to have fun, because this job is a lot of fun, to learn something yourself in the process, and then try to expose everyone else out there, meaning your audience, to whatever it is that you have learned. That's the goal of journalism in the way that I see things. If you do that constantly, regularly, you will get better at your job. And the better you get at your job, the more that you will learn about how to make your stories more engaging. And then is when you will have an impact. So having an impact shouldn't be the primary goal. The primary goal is simply to put at the disposal of the audiences that we talk to the information that they need. And whether we do that using a written story, a spoken story, a data visualization, or a video or whatever, that doesn't matter that much. What matters is that they get the information that they need in a way that they can understand and they can find useful.
Okay, understanding, make everything, the graphics to be understood by
sharing with others. Yeah, whatever it is that you have learned, sharing with others. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Alberto, for your time and then also your presentations to us.
Thank you.
It's lovely and then it's such a pleasure to have you with us. And for the participants or maybe others who cannot join for the sessions this morning because it's morning time in Indonesia. And so we will upload the sessions in our websites at www.dcjci/2022.com, and then you can watch again the whole sessions being recorded there. And so we're going to close these sessions. Thank you everyone for joining with us, and see you soon in other sessions in the following hours. Good morning and good night, Alberto.